But what I want to do is to give you some sense of why he cuts such a special figure in Swedish literature, and I think actually in world literature, but only very recently in the American literary marketplace. Stig Dagerman rose to prominence just after the Second World War, and at a remarkably young age, he had a remarkable literary output, critically acclaimed literary output that included 4 novels, a collection of short stories, a collection of essays on post-war Germany called German Autumn, which has become a modern classic, and really one of the defining texts of that post-war period in continental Europe and in Germany. He wrote 5 plays, and he wrote hundreds and hundreds of poems. And he did all of this at a very young age. Began writing very prolifically and very visibly in the public eye at around the age of, 25, he was already a celebrity. And his celebrity was largely based on the work that I just referenced, German Autumn, when he was sent to Germany in the fall of 1946 to report on, among other things, what was going on in the wake of the war. And most journalists were focusing on the political situation in Germany at the time and the war crimes, trials, and everything else. Dagerman was interested in taking a look at what was going on at the human scale. And so his eye was drawn to the way in which people were living, the way in which people were forced to live after the ravages of war. So based on this groundbreaking first work, Dagerman achieved immediate celebrity and success and had this remarkable output over a very short number of years. It's amazing to think that his entire career as a writer really only lasted, less than a decade, about 9 years. And the first 5 years saw all of that output that I just mentioned. And it wasn't just any output, it was output that was really grabbing people's attention, causing critics and commentators to be already singling him out perhaps as the next Strindberg in Sweden. Then something happened, and that something was that he had extreme difficulty finishing major long works after this remarkably productive period. And during the last 3 or 4 years of his life, while they were not unproductive by any means, he couldn't finish the big projects. He couldn't finish the new novels he started. He couldn't finish the major books he started. And that wasn't the problem, but maybe that was a symptom of another kind of difficulty that he was struggling with. And this is tackled, I think, in the second film that we're going to look at today, Our Need for Consolation. That's as much as I'll say about this right now, except to say that Stig Dagerman tragically committed suicide at the age of 31 in 1954, by which point he had not been a professional writer even a full decade, but he left a remarkable literary legacy. I'm going to take a few paragraphs from my translator's note in the book that I've just translated of short stories called Sleet, to give you a sense of what kind of writer Stig Dagerman was. While covering post-war Germany as a foreign correspondent for the Swedish newspaper Expressen in autumn 1946, Stig Dagerman was advised by a fellow correspondent in the Allied Press Corps, with the best of intentions and for the sake of objectivity, quote, to read German newspapers instead of looking at German dwellings or sniffing in German cooking pots. The criticism leveled against Dagerman was against his ambition to chronicle the supposedly indescribable realities of life for ordinary Germans in a land left in ruins at a time when world sympathies for the German people were at an all-time low and the need to judge and punish the guilty was at an all-time high, when the press corps and all the world were focused on the drama and the expiation of the Nuremberg war crimes trials. Dagerman sought instead to chronicle as nakedly as possible the suffering of all the remaining victims of the war and its ravages, with an eye unaffected by the collective need to assign guilt for the atrocities of a horrendous Nazi regime. What followed were the series of articles that later became the book German Autumn that I've already referenced. which examined the very nature of human suffering and the moral complexities of justice. As he came to understand just how much his own motivations were at odds with those of the International Press Corps, Dagerman wrote in frustration to fellow Swedish writer Carl Werner Aspenström in the midst of his assignment in Germany. And I'll quote that letter here. "A journalist I have not yet become, and it doesn't look as if I'll ever be one. I have no wish to acquire all the deplorable attributes that go to make up a perfect journalist. I find it hard to meet the people staying at the Allied Press Hotel. They think that a small hunger strike is more interesting than the hunger of multitudes. While hunger riots are sensational, hunger itself is not sensational. And what these poverty-stricken and bitter people here think becomes interesting only when poverty and bitterness break out in a catastrophe. Journalism is the art of coming too late as early as possible. I'll never master that." If journalism was the art of coming too late as early as possible, then in Dagerman's short fiction, which he began to turn increasingly to fiction as a mode of writing, this was the antithesis of that. This is what he looked to try to provide an antidote to what he saw as the problem with the entire sort of situation or the circumstance under which journalism was practiced. And so his fiction sought to be that antithesis, the art of coming in time. In his focus on fragile human subjects, particularly young people swept up in and swept aside by forces much greater than themselves, Dagerman sought to trigger links of identification and empathy that would give his readers an understanding of the tragedies of human suffering before it was too late. His classic short story, To Kill a Child, is a fine example of this. For a meager fee of only 75 kroner, about $10, Dagerman was commissioned by what was essentially the Swedish Society for Roadway Safety to write a cautionary tale as a campaign designed to get Swedish motorists to slow down on highways when speeding was becoming an increasingly difficult public safety issue. What could have been an ephemeral and gimmicky work of public service fiction became perhaps the greatest short story in the history of Swedish letters. For in this tale, Dagerman took the simple redressing of a particular social problem as a starting point rather than as an end in itself. And out of these mundane materials, he created a poignant tale of choice, of chance, and human loss that, in my view, and I think in the view of a lot of observers of modern literature and modern Swedish literature, rises to the highest levels of art and literary balance, philosophical concision. So I think this story stands as an example of Dagerman trying to perfect, instead of the art of coming too late, the art of coming in time.